Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and I am talking to an expert in comparative mythology. She's a philologist. Her name is Paola Corrente. Did I properly pronounce it there that time?
Perfect.
Thank you so much for joining me. I came across your work while reading James George Frazer's work on the Golden Bow and was fascinated with how he wrote imitative magic, the two forms of magic, and just got lost in this long book. And then my buddy Neil from Gnostic Informant was like, listen, everyone acts like the category of dying and rising gods is defunct. It is extinct. No one takes that serious anymore. And I said, okay, well, I've heard people in the past, scholars that I've interviewed, say dying and rising gods is a thing. Some of these scholars flirt with the idea that the concept and the category may have had influence down the road into Christianity. But we're going to put that to the shelf on the side because we're going to dive into the gods of the ancient world and see if this is a good category. So before we do, can you tell us a little bit about what your specialty is, what you focused on, how you got introduced into this whole concept or this whole idea of dying and rising gods?
Oh, okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me. And you know that I love very much this topic. So, how do I study the stars? I don't remember. Yeah, because it was a long time ago. I was fascinated by Fraser. And for my PhD, in fact, I changed the topic of my PhD dissertation. When I discovered Fraser, I decided to focus on the dying and rising gods. Um, so I study, as you said, comparative mythology. I am a classicist by training, and now I am focused on comparative mythology, Greece and Mesopotamia. And I'm trying to study more about Mesopotamia because it's not my field of study, the original field of study. And I'm studying Sumerian, and now I I I didn't leave the dying rising god because for me they are always there. I always think about them. But now I'm studying other things, another myth, a very important myth from Mesopotamia, and and yes, for now I'm doing that. But my book is on the dying and rising gods, and my idea is writing more about it and in English because my book is in Italian. So I hope I can write something in English so it can have a wider distribution. And so the big question, the rising and dying gods, in my opinion, and I have been studying it for this topic for many, many years, I think it is a working category. And I think that gods die and resurrect. And I think that there is a connection between the Christian resurrection, death and resurrection, and the ancient gods in general. Okay, so now we can go in more in mm, seeing some particular things because I focused in my book and my research in general on two gods mainly. Baal, who is a god from Ugarit, and is like Zeus, so is the god of storm. And on Inanna Ishtar, who is this greatest god from Mesopotamia. She is the goddess of sex and war. And she has other things, she does other things, but these are her two main provinces, sex and war. Of course, there is Dionysus because my book is on Dionysus and the comparison between him and these two gods.
And just so everybody knows, Paola is like her accent. If you don't understand Dionysus, is Dionysus. So we have Inanna, Baal or Bel, and Dionysus, and her book goes into various other deities as well. So she gets into Yerud and all sorts of like even obscure deities that seem to be figures who die and come back to life. I know you want to get into Inanna. These are the main three I think we're going to talk about today. But maybe before you give evidence to just showing why you think this is the case, it might be worth giving a little bit of history,
Uh-huh.
like leading up to this, because I know scholarly friends who just echo the consensus or echo the typical idea and say, Jonathan Z. Smith has dismantled this category, or there are no dying and rising gods, and they just kind of don't accept this. Do you feel like you would like to at least vocalize and give why you don't agree, and then we can get into them?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, yeah, I would like to explain a couple of things. I focus on Baal and Inanna, and well, in the case of Dionysus, the fact that he dies and resurrects is nobody argue about that because he dies and resurrects. Baal and Inanna, I found them very interesting because they are not very much dealt with in the general discourse about the dying and rising gods. And in my opinion, there is a clear reason why they are not very much known as, well, more Baal. Inanna Ishtar, because in her case, as we will see, the myth is complicated. And in her myth, there is, in the myth of Inanna, who goes to the underworld, it appears another famous dying god who is Dumuzi. So the studies have concentrated on him, let her alone, her apart. So she's not very much considered a dying goddess. So my interest for them was because I had things to work with. I had sources, and mm, I can say something new because my opinion is that about dying and rising God, as you said, scholars tend to repeat the main opinion that the dying and rising God category is not working and is like history of religion, but it has nothing more. And since I don't like to simply repeat things, I like to contribute with something new. I thought that these two gods can give me the opportunity to do that.
And just
About
so people don't, in case people don't know, when Frazer wrote The Golden Bow, he didn't have the information we have now about Inanna that you now have. And so if he did, he would have commented on this. He would have included it, I imagine, into this comparative rebirth, revivification, resurrection motif. I have no doubts about that.
Yeah, because he didn't there. At his time there was the entire myth that we have now. So he gave an erroneous interpretation because he didn't have the entire myth. So he thought that the story was about something else. Then now that we have it's not complete, but we have the text more complete than he had, so we can see other things. Frazer was the point is that Frazer was not always right, but as all the scholars, we are not infallible. But he had flaws in his theories, but much part of his theory was correct. That's the thing. And so about the other gods, because as you say, there are many other gods considered dying and rising gods. And now I say the name like with an Italian accent: Adonis, Osiris, Dumuzi, for example, Attis, and then there are the Phoenician gods like Eshmun, Melkart. There is Telipino. There are, and then in Greece, usually apart from Dionysus, there are Demeter and Persephone. So this group is, it varies through the years because sometimes there is some gods, another day they take a god away and they put another one. So it's a very flexible group.
Like the Muzid in Inanna, where half the year, it depends on the myth, but half the year Demuzid and then half the year Inanna, they switch in the
No, this
underworld.
is no, it's not Inanna. Inanna goes
Oh, it's
back
not
to
Inanna.
her, his sister.
Got it, got it. Okay, so the sister and then Demuzid, they switch, her lover or ex-lover, and then, they kinda switch back and forth between her sister and Demuzid. Okay,
Like his sister. Geshtinanna is the sister of Dumuzi. And
okay.
they
So they take turns.
like yeah, like in the case with Demeter and with Persephone. Persephone spent, say, 6 months under the underworld, and 6 months on the earth. It's the same thing. It's the alternation pattern. We call it the alternation pattern. Mhm. Oh, see, the other important thing, the other important point is that in the case of Dionysus, Inanna, and Baal, they actually die. They are murdered. And you don't have this in the case with other gods. Sometimes they are not killed. They just go to the underworld.
Osiris
Mm.
is murdered, of course, too. And
S-
and it but, this is probably something you don't see in the field when you engage with other scholars who might not agree with you, but on the online world, where just normal people are trying to engage this stuff, who don't like this idea,
Mhm.
because if there are other gods in the stories that die and rose again from the dead, then maybe mine's not special in their mind. And so, they feel very, very protective, defensive, and so they wanna try and make every reason to make theirs different and unique, but all of them are different and unique. One of the things they do is say, Osiris, when he resurrected, he just stayed in the underworld.
Mhm.
And I'm like, "Okay." In one of the accounts, I did hear that Isis gathers his body parts,
Yeah.
minus the penis,
Mhm.
and then creates one,
Mhm.
brings him back to life in this world temporarily, just so she can get pregnant by him, and then he rules the underworld. So, like, there's a moment, if you read this, there's a moment it seems he is alive here when she brings him back to life through her magical laments and incantations, but it's only temporary. And if I were to shift this on to Jesus, for example, he shows up after he's dead only momentarily. Then he
Mhm.
goes somewhere else where he's supposed to rule. I'm not saying they're a Xerox copy, but I'm saying there is a similarity in that idea. I mean, it's not just Jesus. I think you could even say Zalmoxis, or you could go into different examples. Do you have a comment on that?
Many. In fact, I'm writing down all what you said because there are many things there. Let's see about the similarities. Now, first of all, it's important that you say that all these gods are unique because no, in some cases you can see a very close resemblance between myth. For example, Adonis, Attis. You can see they are very similar for many reasons. But in many cases, Dionysus, Inanna, Baal, they are Osiris. They are very, very unique. They have something that the other don't have. So the fact, yes, what you said, people don't like. So there are people that don't like the idea, but it's not about your feeling. It's about the fact. So if we have texts that they say something, that we can be sure about the interpretation that we can give to the text, because sometimes texts are ambiguous. So you know, eh, many interpretation can be possible, but sometimes the text is clear, so we can give one interpretation, and still you have the right not to like it. It's okay. I mean, but the text is there. I don't know. This is something which I have very very clear. I mean, if I have a text that says something that I can't argue with, I don't do it.
So
I don't
this
see
is
the point.
why. Okay, and I guess this. Let me play one clip. Of course, this is something you've already echoed. You've already pointed out that you think the category is good. You've mentioned in other places you think that it just needs to be organized better and that we need to do a better job of how we organize the category. But you don't say that it's not a legit category. You think that this is a legit category. And that's important to point out. Am I correct on that? Okay. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. Okay, here we go. Quick clip here so people can get up to date on a question that was brought up to William Lane Craig, and this was what he had to say. Okay, I won't bog you down into too many details because I could see your face and you were already going, what? So, Paola, you're a dinosaur, I guess,
I
is
am.
what
It
he.
seems that I am.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, we people who think that dying and rising gods exist, it's not a movement. We are not part of a movement. I personally don't want to prove anything to anybody. I just would like to be a good scholar and have something important to say, and and do my research in a very good manner without having ideologies or some aim that I have to do. Like I have to prove that Jesus. No, I don't care.
Yeah, you don't care.
It's not my interest. I don't. I we we scholars the think that dying and rising gods are is a category. Uh, we know that the resurrection of Jesus is another thing. They are different things. We are not saying that they are the same thing because they are not. I mean, we should be. I mean, no, you can't say that it's the same thing. We know that in the case of Jesus, there are many new things that we don't find in ancient gods. We know that the kind of the typology of resurrection is different. But the fact that the resurrection of pagan, as he said, of the gods previous to Christianity, that they this myth, this story of death and resurrection influence Christianity, it's possible because religions are in ancient time, like now, they are in connection. In certain case, we can prove the connection, the relation between the religion. We can say when, for example, something was exchanged. We can say it. So I don't think that there are valid and conclusive arguments. I understand what he and many other people say, but I don't see how this can prove that the ancient gods did not die and resurrect, because their resurrection of my gods, the ancient gods, is different. And it is true that Osiris does not come back on earth, but that's not the point. The point is that he was dead, he was killed, so he died, and then he came back to life. That's it. That's where the place where he goes is not implied in the resurrection of the ancient gods. The point is that they were killed in general, they died, and then they were alive again. That's the point.
Wherever they are, they live again, is the point.
Of
So
course, we want to be precise. So we want to say in the case of Osiris, he stays in the underworld. In the case
Mhm.
of Inanna, he comes back, and so on. In
Does
case of
Inanna come back?
Jesus,
Inanna comes back to the earth, correct?
yes.
Like, okay, okay. So let me ask you this: I'm playing a game, just being funny here. Where is Jesus right now? According to the story. According to the story. You see what I'm trying to say? You know where I'm going with this. Now, I'm not trying to say, look, you can believe. I'm not against people having beliefs, okay? Faith is very deep. It's important to many people in this world. I'm saying when I see Jesus, he shows up here for a moment and then he lives in a different place that is not on earth. So it just seems like they're not being fair with the ancient myths and how they're treating them when they're special pleading for their own to be right. We're right, everyone's wrong. And you know that that's been going on for 2,000 years since, Abrahamic monotheism and stuff like that. So um, I wanted to reverse that just to point out, like, so what if Osiris does reign in the underworld according to their story, then Jesus reigns in the upper world in a different place. Like it's not much different to me.
Um, yeah, I mean, to me, it's clear. To me, it's not a point that can, it's not an argument. Like say, yeah, this is the argument that I have to prove that the ancient gods do not resurrect. No, we can discuss on it because it's an interesting point in these stories where they go. it's interesting to know, like the other elements, because we want to check all the elements or many of them. So you want to know why Osiris stay down the earth and the other one goes up, and and all the cases that we have. We want to know because it's part of and we recognize it. I don't know. I don't know why he said that Mettinger. I don't know. Made the book of Mettinger on Dying Gods, and he defending the category, say that it's working. I don't know why say that. I have no idea. I have, if I
I
can.
think personally, I think his audience will never read Mettinger, so they're just listening to him. I think that's maybe the case, but sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's, but I have, I can cite something that he says in his book, The Riddle of Resurrection. He says, one sometimes notes in the research certain evasive strategies designed to avoid the conclusion that the notion of dying and rising deities might be a pre-Christian phenomenon. Ancient Near Eastern gods are freely granted the privilege of rising or returning as long as they behave like gentlemen and not do so before Christ.
That's funny.
Yeah.
It is. So, okay, we haven't really delved into how we know they rise so that you can actually explain the gods who rose. Can you tell us in their stories how we can be pretty confident that the data, the texts themselves, the whether it's hieroglyphics, whether it's on tablets of stone or clay tablets or papyri, how do we know that they rose
Well,
in their story?
in certain cases, we have the text that clearly say that. In the case, the clearest case is Inanna, because Inanna Ishtar, I give both names. Inanna is the Sumerian name, and Ishtar is the Akkadian name of this goddess, to be precise. So we have the tablet. We have the myth about the death and resurrection, let's say resurrection of Inanna, is called the descent of Inanna Ishtar to the underworld. We have a Sumerian version and an Akkadian version. The most useful for us for us now is the Sumerian because it's more precise, and we have clearly stated in the text that she dies and comes back to life. In the case of the Akkadian, we have some ambiguous term, but it's very interesting to analyze the term that is used about the death of Ishtar in the Akkadian text. So in our case, we have the text clearly, in my opinion, clearly stating that the goddess die and resurrect. In the case, then we can see the wording if you want. In the case of Baal, for example, there we have some problems because in the tablets, again, we have tablets in as well for the Ugaritic text. The myth is not complete, so the tablets are broken in several passages, and unlikely they are broken. One of the problem we have with the text that we miss the part when he dies. We don't know directly from the text how he dies. We have what happened before and what happened after, but not the part where he dies and comes back. But from what we have, in my opinion and in opinion of other scholars, it's I mean, we can say that he dies and resurrects, comes back to life, even if we don't have the exact passages. But in the case of Baal, I can understand that some scholars say, no, we can't say that he dies and resurrects because we don't have the text.
Just to make your point clear, you kind of have three types, I feel, but maybe there's two types of scholars mainly. Correct me in anything I ever say so that people understand. One, some say before it seems like he is getting attacked or killed, and we don't know exactly how, but it seems to imply that Mot, the specific god of death, meaning this is death, swallows Baal. And then
Mhm.
afterward, you get this implication of, you can tell that they're mourning his death. There's some type of mourning where they're saying, like a funeral, like he's dead, but then he's back. Am I correct? But they don't tell you the details of it. So you have scholars who think that, like you. Then you have some who say, okay, we're missing stuff. I don't want to make too. That might be true, but I don't want to say anything unless we found the tablet. And then you have some that would say, actually, he just disappears and they mistook him for dying, but he didn't really die. He just disappears for a while and then comes back. So it's like me finding out you die, but you really just go missing. And I have a funeral and I'm like, oh, Paola, she's dead. And then you show up. It's like, oh, you weren't dead. Like, is that the three kind of
Yeah.
main categories?
Yes, but now we are talking just about the Baal, the cycle of Baal, the Baal cycle. There are
Yes.
we should take into account other texts too, but related to this myth, the situation is the exact one you described. Yes, there is the possibility that it just disappears, but in my opinion, the opinion of other scholars, I mean, when you do a funeral for somebody, it's because you know he's dead. I mean, and he, as you said, we don't know exactly what happened, but he knows that the text breaks just when Baal is going down to the underworld to be swallowed by Moth. So he's going to the underworld to be killed by or to be eaten by, and of course it's a metaphor, the death god who eats the people.
I wonder if there's any influence from Ishtar and Inanna's mythos to Baal, or if there's any influence from Osiris's mythos to Baal. Just this concept, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
It
But
could be. Mm.
I was thinking about Inanna too, where you talk about she comes back to Earth. There are some scholars who think that the story of Esther, there's a well-known Bible story of Esther, and there's a man in it, a wise man who's very important in the story named Mordecai. Some scholars actually think their names are Ishtar
Wow.
and Marduk, Marduk. And so you have Ishtar and Marduk kind of being anthropomorphic. Like, here's this new story of this queen, Esther and Marduk, or Mordecai, who have a similar kind of theme in the narrative to what we find with Ishtar in some of their accounts. But sorry, that was a little rabbit trail. I just wanted to mention it in passing. There's kind of a resurrection theme in it where they're literally about to die, be destroyed, and then they're saved and they come back and they're able to live. But Baal, is it not true that Jonathan Z. Smith thinks that he just left and went missing?
Yes.
And you're
Yeah.
saying I'm sorry.
No. You go ahead.
The text, you say, when you look at the text, this looks like a death and a resurrection.
Yes. I don't know how to classify somebody who goes, or the fact that somebody goes to the underworld saying to the god of death, I'm coming to you to have you eaten me. So, and he say, come so I can swallow you. I don't know how to classify it. To me, it's a metaphor of death. Because even with Inanna is the same thing. She does a catabasis, which is the technical term to say going to the underworld, a catabasis. She goes to the underworld. And in her case, which is extremely interesting, it's like there are a symbolic death, which is the catabasis, because when you go to the underworld, it's a metaphorical death, unless you go for some um, heroic action like taking somebody back, like in the case of Orpheus, that goes to the underworld to fetch his bride. But in general, going to the underworld is a metaphor for death. So Inanna does the catabasis, and when she arrives to the underworld, and she gets later maybe we say all the particulars, they are very interesting, but when she goes to she enters the underworld, the judges condemn her to death, and so she's killed. So it's like there is a double death, because there is a symbolic death when she goes down, and then she's actually killed in the end.
Mm. Mm. So it reminds me of later on in Christian theology, you have the idea of the first death and then the second death.
Hmm.
They believe that this can die, but when you go to be judged, that is the second death, and that's the permanent, death. She overcomes the second death. If you take that kind of theology view, she comes back to the land of the living. I like the idea of a catabasis. On Bell, real quick, before we move on from Bell, the Bell cycle, we have that missing part of the fragment, but it seems to imply, like you said, he dies and he's back. Are there other stories with Bell that indicate you think that maybe make you think, yeah, this might be a well understood thing for Bell of dying and rising? Is there any other indications that you find?
There are other myths, but they are more ambiguous. In other stories seems that he disappears. But in this one, I think that there are some references in other texts to the life of Baal, like pointing the fact that he dies and comes back to life. But there are references. The myth in this the Baal cycle is the one where we can see. I don't say clearly, but with some degree of certainty that he dies and comes back. And now I remember you said there is the sea. We know how he comes back to life because his sister, Anat, who is a warrior goddess, she knows about the death of Baal. While the other gods are wailing and preparing the funeral, she goes and She kills Mot. She um how how do you she does like she sow like with the plant.
Yeah, kind of like Inanna, where they have food and drink of life plant, right? Is it something like that?
Um no, it's something that is connect. I will write you the verb.
Soma?
Mhm. This one.
Oh, Sue. Sue.
Yeah, it's what you do with the plant when you want to the seed of a plant you want it to grow.
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You
What's the verb?
plant, you sow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's what she does. She kills him and then she saw him because if he has eaten Baal, right? The story, we know that he said to Baal, "Come here, and I'm going to swallow you." And he says, "I'm coming to you." And so he Mot swallows Baal, right? We can infer this from text.
Yes.
How can you have him back?
He's got
If
to grow back. You're saying, like,
so, because Baal and Mot now are mixed together because Baal has been eaten by Mot, so is inside Mot. So the only way it has to be a kind of magical way because how can you have him back? So she, Anat, kills Mot, saw him, because sowing him, she is sowing Baal back, and so he comes back. And the vegetation part, because remember that Fraser said that the dying and rising gods were related to vegetation, which is true. It's not the dominant factor in some stories, but it is a big factor in the stories of death and resurrection. So this is a vegetation ritual, this way of doing things. And in the case, as you said, Inanna is revived with magical means because with the plant and water of life. And Osiris is the same things. Isis uses magic to have him back. And in the
yes.
case of Dionysus, it's the same thing. You have to use magic to have somebody dead to come back to life. It's the only, unless you have the case of Jesus, but this is another thing. But with my gods, the only way you can have somebody killed back is using magic.
So, man, so obviously magic is a very clear thing that is welcomed in the ancient myths, and it doesn't the term gets used almost like a derogatory term by the time you get into the 1st century in the Gospels. When you say someone's a magus or a magician, it's like you're a witch. It's like mean,
Mhm.
but when you do it and your team, your group, your cult says it's good, well, you're just a holy person. That's not magic. But if they do it, that's magic. So they found like the meaning of the words change over time. But something you said makes me think about several things. Number one, when you said that Mott swallowed Baal, immediately I'm thinking of the Titans and Dionysus. The Titans swallow him, but it sounds like Baal mixed with Osiris and Dionysus because he gets swallowed like Mott. The Titans, though, they're not death. They're clearly a different category of beings, but they swallow him, and then, if I'm not mistaken, Zeus destroys them, depending on the myth. And then there's the regrowing from the ashes of the Titans, which includes Dionysus' rebirth or revivification, where he comes back to life through the agricultural cycle where he's coming back. And I think about that. But the other thing is, what is it called when you have a priest holding bread, holding wine? They say some magic words. They don't call them magic. They say they're sacred and holy. They say their magic words, and then it transforms into the literal body and the literal blood. And then when you eat it, you literally become one with that God. The God dwells in you, and this gives you life. Same with baptism, but I'm just making a point. That sounds, it's new, it's different in a way, but it's also similar in a very significant way that I'm thinking, hmm, why are they doing this? You know? So the agricultural argument I hear a lot is that the gods you're describing are agricultural, they're cyclical, they're every year.
Mm.
And I wanted to just throw this out there to you and ask you, when I'm reading about the New Testament and its apocalypticism, it has an expectation of the end, the Jewish idea of apocalypticism. It talks about creation groaning for renewal, a new heaven and a new earth. So, yeah, that's different than maybe what we see in the myths of these other gods, but it is concerned about nature and a permanent fix rather than a temporary fix where death and rebirth, death and rebirth. It's the idea of like, let's stop that. Permanent life, no more death. It's still in the same way, in a sense, to me at least. It looks like it could be understood like that.
Well, um, there is something interesting with the vegetation because with well, it's a little bit complicated, but in the case, for example, with Dionysus, Inanna, and Baal, they are not vegetation gods. Well, Dionysus more than yes, Dionysus has a strongest um, um, relationship with vegetation than the other two. But in the case of Baal and Inanna, the relation to the vegetation, it's not direct, so to speak, because Baal is a storm god, and the water from the sky, the rain, is important to have the vegetation and the plant on earth, because if you don't have water, you can't have the life on earth, no, or vegetation. So his connection with vegetation is there. He's not a god of vegetation, but his relation with vegetation is very strong anyways. Inanna control the sexual order of animal, plant, and people. So she is related to life in any case. She's not a vegetation goddess, but she has a connection indirect with the vegetation, because to have people and animal and plant on earth, you need the procreation. And she is in charge of that. So the relation is there. But then we have an important aspect of the order, the universal order. For polytheism, it was fundamental, the idea of order and disorder, the chaos and order. So when this greatest gods like Inanna, Osiris, Baal, who are very important in the pantheon. They are not, minor gods. They are very important gods. So when they die, in the case of Inanna, is very clear. You have an inversion of order. When she goes to the underworld, you have an inversion of order because life on earth stops because the goddess in charge of it goes down the earth. So you have to reestablish again the order. More than the life of vegetation, which is implied in the order, in the universal order, you have to reestablish the order, which is more important. So in some gods like Adonis, Attis, whom I call the minor gods, because in their myth they are always together with a goddess. So they are a couple. And the goddess is more important than them. For example, Adonis is in the couple with Aphrodite. And thus Aphrodite is much more important than him because Adonis in Greece mythology is not a god, is not an important, it's important just in this myth with her. So in the case with Inanna, Baal, Dionysus, and Osiris, they are gods very important on their own. They don't need another gods to make them important. And they die. And their death is separated from other figures. I don't know if I'm clear on this.
Yes.
So in the minor gods, vegetation like the alternation, spring, autumn is more present. It's like an alternation of vegetation. Like they are spirit of vegetation. Demons like not bad, but demons like minor gods of vegetation. In the case with these great gods, they control the universal order, which is a little different. It's a more important idea within the polytheism.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Again, there are many stories, as you point out, but there's also stories where the kings, right, that back in Sumerian kings list, there's chaos, and then they bring established order, these god kings. But like later in Christianity, just looking at Jesus, he is said in the Gospel of John, and Paul's letters seem to indicate he's a demiurgic figure. So he is seen in this literature as someone who is there at creation and part of creation. And within the biblical account, what is it all about? Taking chaos and making it ordered. And so there is a sense in which this still plays into that same picture of chaos and order. And he's the logos, the word that brings that order about in creation. So he's a very significant deity, though he's considered the son of God. And I was reading somewhere in Orphic hymns where it sounded like Orphism with Dionysus, that he kind of seemed in some of the text to sound like someone who's in at least controlling, he's like the logos. He has control over the nature and things like that. He
No.
is a god of life. He's not just grapes. He's not just wine. He's much more important than that. And I think people get so caught up on the myth about wine that they don't see how much more important this god is.
Yeah, it's like with Inanna or Aphrodite. I mean, we know her like the Aphrodite, like the goddess of beauty. No, she's the goddess of Eros, which is a different things. Of course, she's beautiful because she has to suscitate passion and desire, so she has to be beautiful. But she's not the goddess of beauty. She's the goddess of sex and Eros, the desire, which comes before, because you need the desire to proceed with love and everything else, but you need something before, and she incarnates that, like Inanna. Of course, Inanna maintains in her story, in her history in Mesopotamia, this aspect of the god of sex and war. Aphrodite becomes like in the traditional Greek mythology, the goddess of love, but she has an Oriental origin, so he's like Inanna, very much like Inanna.
Hmm. Wow. So you have found certain terms in these myths that have common elements. They share a similar phrase that we find even in the New Testament. Can you describe that
Mm.
to us?
Yes, I was well, I took the text and I started to see what the text has have to say, because I wasn't convinced that the category of Fraser was wrong. So I say I will see the text, and I will I check the verbs, and in the case of Baal, the verb are very general. They talk about to die, and then they use the verb to die when he dies, of course, and then for the resurrection, which is the most problematic issues, because with the death, okay, scholars can accept it. The problem is the resurrection, so I focus more on the resurrection. And in the case of Baal, um, the verb is ambiguous in the sense that it just means live again. So okay,
Say it
but
again.
it's good. I mean, they say that he's dead, and then he comes back to life, live again. The interesting verb is the Sumerian, because when Inanna dies, so we said she goes to the underworld, she's condemned to death by the judges. She dies, and the Sumerian is very clear, because, in my opinion, because the text say that she's transformed in a corpse. So I think she's dead. If you are a corpse, well, you're dead. And then when she comes back to life, uh, because in our language, yes, in our languages, modern languages, when we imply that somebody comes back to life, we use the verb to resurrect is what we say. Um, and in the Sumerian text, so the text translates, and Inanna resurrected, arose. And I went to see the Sumerian, and the verb is uh, Inanna stood up. So she's a corpse, and the text say that she hang up. She is transformed in a corpse, and they put her like on hooks, like
Like
that.
a hook. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Meat on a hook. Yeah.
that is a meat on a hook. This is. And then when they do all the ritual with the plant and the water, she stood up. That's the verb in Sumeria, which I find very interesting, because the usual verb used to indicate the resurrection of Jesus is the Greek anistemi, which means to stand up. So it's exactly the same verb, but Sumerian, the text from Mesopotamia, go way back, like
Yes,
third
yes.
millennium, second millennium. So, but I find it extremely interesting, the fact that there is the correspondence between these verbs.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting observation that makes you at least consider they have a similar concept they're trying to convey that may have a long history in the stories and beliefs of people. And to me, it's obvious. I always was reading this as a young boy in the New Testament, and Paul would say they fell asleep, and now he means they died. Those who have fallen asleep already, they're already dead. He doesn't mean they went to sleep, like just like, but the idea of death and sleep are very overlapping. And then it says that he stood up, the resurrection, to stand up in the Greek. And I thought, oh, wow. And then you found this in the Sumerian way, way back. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, the story about Inanna is she resurrected. And you said that that exact term isn't used in the myths as far as you've found so far. That exact term is not in Dionysus. But
Mhm.
yeah, did you want to
Is
comment on it? Yeah, I just was going to finish and say, can you tell us how, since that term's not used, why scholars think he resurrected?
because he comes back to life. In this case, I mean, in fact, this is interesting. So you can see how is very changeable the scholarship, because in the case of Inanna, where again I think it's very clear her death and resurrection, at least in the Sumerian text, they wouldn't take her into account. In the case with Baal, which again is it's not clear that he dies and resurrects, they would say no, Baal disappears. In the case with Dionysus, where we have many texts, late texts, and many variant version of the same of the myth, the famous Orphic myth, we have different versions. But they don't deny that he dies and resurrects. This I find this very funny to a certain extent, because it's the more complicated case of the three. But in general, it's accepted that he dies and resurrects, because the myth tells us that he's dead after the Titans hits him, and then they tries a different way to have him back, like putting together his limbs, and then they take the earth and give him to Zeus, and then they do a potion, and they made Semele to drink the potion. So we have the description of the he's coming back, and then he's alive again. So we have, like I say, in the case of Baal, scholars can say we don't have the sequence, so we don't know. In the case of Baal, we have the story of how he's brought back to life. So it's difficult to say no, he does not resurrect. They can say no, he does not resurrect, like in the case of Jesus, for example. It's a different resurrection. But they can't argue about the fact that he comes back, because we have the description, we have the story.
So, as far as Dionysus goes, you said a lot of these texts that we have are late. When I was looking into just trying to understand more about Dionysus, I got caught up in reading Euripides and Sophocles, and then finding out when Sophocles is writing his play, his tragedy, he's talking about the Eleusinian
Mm.
mystery cults. And a lot of the people seem to cry out that they believe they will have immortality and live
Well,
forever in a afterlife, in a blessed
look,
afterlife, because of Dionysus in some way. Um, is so do we have any implications before the 1st century in your view that Dionysus is dead and then comes back to life before
uh,
Jesus?
yes, we have texts before Christ that make allusion to this story, the so-called Orphic stories of death and resurrection. We have, they are not very, very ancient, but still they are before Christ. So we have something. And I wanted to say, comment something on what you said before about the sleep and death.
Please.
Because we have, as we said when we were talking about catabasis, we have an actual death. As I said, these gods are killed. And it happens not very often, but for example, is something that happens in Mesopotamian mythology. We have gods who are killed. They are called the dead gods, and they are killed. So it's something not common, but it can happen. But so this would be a real death. That's why I focus on Dionysus in Baal, because they die. They are killed. But then you have a metaphorical death. The first metaphor for death is sleep. In ancient times too, because it's the more similar to death is when you sleep. It's the first metaphor for death. And then you have the catabasis, so the travel to the underworld, which is another metaphor. Then we have the binding. We have gods who are bound. So when they are bound, it means that they can't operate, they can't do what they have to do, they can't exercise their power. So it's like that you have killed them, because if a god can do what he has to do, it's useless. So this is another metaphor for death, the gods in chain. And we have several examples in Greek mythology too of the gods in chain, because he can do what he has to do. So it's like he were dead because he can't do
Kind
the
of
things.
Like Prometheus on the rock when he's chained to
Stay
the rock.
bound. Yeah.
By the way,
And
I see a lot of similarities with that, not identical, but the idea how he sacrifices himself for humanity and is unlike other characters who die for 3 days, they get their punishment for 3 days, Inanna, Jesus, you name
the
it. Um, he is a permanent. Now I know Heracles later in some of the stories saves him and breaks the chains, and he's such a great character. I love Heracles. But I think to myself, man, I never fully understood, like, how is it I guess if I was sacrificing everything, that would be a permanent sacrifice, not just 3 days. So Prometheus really went all the way and sacrificed everything, it seems, in the story.
Yeah, so about the mysteries, this is another complicated and very broad field. The problem with Dionysus is exactly the fact that if we look at mysteries, there is this idea that people, common people, um, can suffer in life but have a good afterlife, just like Dionysus, because baby Dionysus was torn apart, so he suffers because he was killed in a very horrible way, but then he came back to life. So the promise of these mystery cults was exactly that, that even if people suffer on life during life, that if they follow these kind of religions, which were no dominant religion in ancient religions, because the general perception of the afterlife was that you simply die, went to the underworld where Hades were there, Persephone were there, and that's it. It was the same life you had on earth, but uglier. That was the idea. The mystery cults introduced the idea of a good afterlife when you could have an eternal life like the Dionysus and
Right.
like Osiris in Egyptian beliefs.
That's very important. I was reading a text with my friend Neil from Gnostic Informant, my buddy that you've met, and there's a story with 2 mystery members. They were members of a mystery cult, and they were actually trying to convert people to join them. And they went to one of these guys. I don't know if this is a satire or what, but they approached this smart thinker and said, "Hey, join us and you'll live forever and have a perfect afterlife and all this." And then the guy goes, "Really? Really?" And they tell him more. And then he goes, "Then why don't you kill yourself now so you can have that life right now?" Like he made a joke and they both walked away and never, they left and didn't want to stick around. I just find it funny because we still today, people knock on your door. "Hey, you want to live forever?" It's like, "Hey, you want to go to heaven now then?" But I see so many, it just, not only in the stories, but in the way humans are, as to why it all led up to Christianity, in my view.
Mhm.
Like, it makes so much sense why Christianity looks like this. And then Jesus has a catabasis. He literally descends into the underworld. Like, he ascends to heaven like Romulus. He descends into the underworld like Dionysus or Orpheus. And Dionysus goes and saves his mother, Ariadne. And I'm like, okay, or is his mother? No, sorry, his Semele. I apologize. Yeah, so there's different stories too that tell different myths, but there's catabasis and there's ascension, and then there's just so many different elements, and the eating of the flesh and drinking of the blood. I look at homophagia. The Maenads would shred the animal, and
Mhm.
according to the story, I don't know if that's historical. I've read a few articles and they're like, "We
Me
don't
too.
know."
I I don't think people could, you know, hear to hear apart like bull. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Just he's even identified as an animal, like you said, a bull. In some accounts, it's a different animal. And Jesus is identified as a lamb, of course, fitting the Jewish idea of the Passover lamb. So they put him in this context, and I just see all the building blocks that are very similar to what we find in the other religions and other myths. Is there anything else that you didn't discuss about dying and rising gods that you wrote down or knew that you needed to talk about that I've somehow missed?
Well, probably, but I think because there are many things. For example, I was remembering that in the case of Dionysus, which is who is a very interesting figure, is that he has all the forms of dying. He goes to the underworld twice. He goes to the underworld twice. Um, then he's killed. And then we have stories about him being a baby and sleeping in the underworld or sleeping in the winnowing fan, which is now I remember the name, which is this ritual of sowing things. And so he does everything. In himself, he has all the forms of death and resurrection. So there are many things, of course, many more things to say. For example, which I think is interesting because in my theory about the death and resurrection of at least these three gods, the most important part is the political part. Because I think, analyzing the text, that Inanna, Baal, and Dionysus are killed in the context of succession. So for the control of the universe, because they are the heir to the previous king. Well, it has to be said best because they are different, but the general frame that I recognize in their death and resurrection is the struggle for succession. And this is what I'm studying more now in other myths because I find it very, in the kingship, I find it very interesting. And Frazer told it, said that the kingship was one of the most important elements in the stories of death and resurrection of gods.
I think Fraser and you are 100% correct. And I get into trouble. I get into trouble by making connections that I think are there. And it's not just me. I'm inspired by very smart people who know the languages very well, who study the material very well, and they're the ones making these connections. And I read them and I'm persuaded. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. For example, Dionysus in Euripides. What's he doing? I'm a god in disguise. I come to my own. He comes to his own family, but they don't receive him. The one person who honored his mother was Cadmus, and there was one other person. There's two, but Cadmus honors her grave, honors his mother. The others are making accusations that Semele didn't really have Zeus impregnate her. Well, what is Dionysus? If he's not the rightful heir with the right religion, the king, not Pentheus, him. He's the one who deserves this. He's the son of the father that was born in the bosom, in the lap of the father. This is the rightful heir. Jesus comes on the scene. You've got Herod the Great. You've got a king. You have Caesar. He's our king. The Jews say he's our king. Well, Jesus comes on and he's the king, the rightful heir in this story, the king.
Well,
And he gets in trouble in the stories for claiming these things. You go back, like you talk about, Osiris is another major one. Many of the pharaohs would identify with not only Osiris, but Horus. And one of the Egyptologists I spoke to, Kara Cooney, recently, I just did an interview with her the other day. Kara Cooney said that Horus is Osiris on Earth. So while Osiris is dead and rules the dead, he is alive in his son Horus on Earth, who is the rightful heir and king. And I thought about the movie Lion King. You know, the lion. It's so much like that. Mufasa kills Osiris. Mufasa is Set. And anyway, I love this stuff, but I feel like that's a trope. And why does Jesus come on as a king if it's not the central point that they're trying to emphasize? I don't know.
no, yes, I think that the kingship, the aspect of the political power is the most important element of the stories, because even if in the minor gods it is present. For example, Adonis is the nephew of a king. And so if we look at all the story, we find an element of kingship in it. In some of them is more evident, like in the case of Dionysus, in the case of Baal, the case of Osiris.
I think of even in the Iliad when it mentions the king Lycurgus that's persecuting he's trying to kill the Dionysus and all the nymphs. He's chasing them and then ends up getting, revenge. Dionysus loves getting revenge on people. Why is the king going after them? Why is Herod going after Jesus? Why is Pharaoh going after Moses? Why is Set going after Osiris? Why is Inanna? Why is a
There are
little
many stories that have this particular element of the future heir who is persecuted.
hmm powerful. I'm so thankful you brought that in
Yes.
because I've heard it, I've thought of it, but I didn't really put it together like that just now.
Yeah, but Dionysus, for example, is royal on both sides, because Zeus is the king of gods and Semele is a princess. So he has both his royalty more than the other, because
So good. What about his mother being Persephone, Corey?
um,
That when that myth comes in that his mother is that, to me, and I don't know, you know much more about this than I do, but to me it makes me think that that story about Dionysus connected to Corey, Persephone, is to show he is the god of the dead as well, not only the living, but of the dead. What am I correct on
mm,
that or?
well, Dionysus has a strong relation to death in several stories, or his epithets, or his animal manifestation is very close to death. So the fact that it can be a different tradition, we can have two different tradition about the motherhood of Dionysus. And then they were blended together, for example, or they try to blend them together, so to give him one mother and not two or three, because he has, which is something common. We can find that it's not, it can happen that we have different parents for a god. So we should, there is sometimes there is no way to understand which is the true uh, tradition. So they can be two different stories. And of course he is a god of the underworld too. There is this famous fragment of Heraclitus, the philosopher, who says that Hades and Dionysus are the same thing, are the same god. So yes, he's very close to death. And in the two catabasis I told you before, he went twice to the underworld. One to, they say, to take his mother back, uh, and he seems at home in the underworld. He seems good there. He knows how to do. He knows what to do. He knows people there. It seems like he stays there. He has been there for time. So yeah, and he was born there according to some myth. His mother was the goddess of the underworld. So yeah.
And that makes him a rightful heir and king of the underworld as well. So you know who else has keys to the underworld? Jesus. It it says he has the keys of death and Hades. So he rules everything, living, dead, just like Dionysus. Um, Thank you so much, Paola. I cannot thank you enough. This has been fantastic. We have so much more we can talk about. I've been learning a lot from you in your book. I hope people will go and read a copy of your book. And any final words from you that you would like to say to our audience?
Oh, no, thank you for inviting me, and I hope people like and understand what I said. Firstly, first and foremost, and they enjoy it, and they maybe they can be curious about things. That's to me, it's the most important thing, that people get curious about my gods. So
Absolutely. I love them, and thank you so much for your time.
thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. If you like this video, hit the like button, drop a comment, tell us what you think. I always learn so much from these academics. I hope you do as well. We appreciate you. Share this out there, and never forget, we are MythVision.